Good afternoon. How is everybody doing? All right, you guys are highly caffeinated and energetic. I love it. Are you guys up for today's session? Great. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you. Throughout the conference, you've heard this year's theme many, many times over, powering growth and influence. The most important thing that we can do as a community to exert our influence is to vote. We have a responsibility to educate ourselves about the candidates, especially those that are running for this nation's highest office. The outcome of the 2016 presidential election will play a critical role in the success of our community and our nation. We heard today earlier from Virginia Governor Jim Gilmore. Now we are pleased to have with us two Democratic candidates for President of the United States. They are here to offer their views regarding critical issues such as education, the economy, healthcare, immigration, climate change, housing, and much more. I encourage you to listen carefully and to what each candidate has to say. Our first candidate is former Governor of Maryland, Martin O'Malley. Let's give him a round of applause. Throughout his 15 years as an elected leader in Maryland, Martin O'Malley has established himself as a bold leader eager to solve issues. Governor O'Malley has served on nearly every level of government in Maryland, first as a member of the Baltimore City Council, then as mayor of Baltimore, and finally as the governor of the state. And most importantly, he was considered Maryland's governor with a Latino soul. As governor, he passed the DREAM Act and led the state to become the first in the nation to defend it at the ballot box. He signed marriage equality into law and improved public safety by giving new Americans driver's licenses. Governor O'Malley fought for environmental protections and made Maryland's public schools the best in the country for 5 years in a row. Governor O'Malley has been committed to including more Latinos at all levels of government. He not only appointed Secretary Tom Perez as his Secretary of Labor, but also appointed Maryland's first ever Hispanic male judge. He recognizes the entrepreneurial spirit and business acumen of the Latino community. And as governor, he increased government contracts to Hispanic businesses by over 150%. No matter the role, Governor O'Malley has always put working families first and fought to preserve the American dream. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to the Honorable Martin O'Malley.
Thanks. Well, thank you very, very much. Good afternoon. It is wonderful to be here with all of you, and I want to thank your chair, Congresswoman Linda Sanchez. Big round of applause for Congresswoman Sanchez. I want to thank all of you for the important work that you do and the important work of CHCI. And I want to talk with you in our short time together about the American dream, about its importance, about its truth, about the responsibility we have to reinvigorate it and make it real around the kitchen tables of every family in America. My name is Martin O'Malley. I am a lifelong Democrat. I am running for president. I intend to win, and I need your help to rebuild that American dream. Now, I know that one of the big issues that challenges us today as a people, one of the very issues that has allowed us to become the land of opportunity, to build up a strong economy, is the issue of immigration. For me, I believe that that issue comes down to human dignity, that unshakable belief that we have maintained as a people for 240 years in the human dignity of every person. And in our country, our hope, our strength derives from the truth that we understand that in our nation there's no such thing as a spare American. Each of us is needed, and we have to help each other if we're going to succeed. So today I wanted to share with you my vision for that new and better future, and I wanted to share with you also the important and critically important role that our new American neighbors play in making it real. But before I do, I want to touch on something that I think all of us must acknowledge. which also cuts to the value that we put on every human life. And that is this very painful truth. Look, as a nation, we have failed to respond to the continued deadly reality of the proliferations of guns and illegal guns in our society as a people. And I cannot be in front of a gathering of this many Americans without touching on this at the outset, especially given the tragedy we saw in Oregon last week. I am challenging every Democrat who is running for our party's nomination and seeking the highest office in this land of President of the United States to join me in forging a new consensus for common sense gun safety legislation that has 4 specific, meaningful gun safety provisions. Number 1, we should ban the sale of combat assault weapons in our country. Secondly, we should require everyone who buys a gun to go through universal background checks with fingerprints and be licensed in order to do so. Third, we should use the purchasing power of our federal government, the largest purchaser of guns in this country, to insist that gun manufacturers implement the highest and best safety technology in all of their firearms in order for us to do business and purchase them. And fourth, we should make illegal gun trafficking a federal crime in the United States of America. One American life is worth more than all of the guns and all of the gun sales and all of the money from them that can be generated in this country. It's time that we govern that way, that we make choices that are in keeping with our principles as a people. It's easy to follow polls. It's more difficult to forge a new consensus. But every election is an opportunity for deeper understanding. And that deeper understanding can lead to better actions. We're the only nation on this, only advanced nation on this planet that has this sickness of gun violence and buries as many of our sons and daughters. It's time to change it. And we can do that in these Democratic primaries and in this Democratic debate. So let me talk to you a little more largely about a few other issues. And in particular, I'd like to focus on the American dream. I laid out 15 strategic goals for restoring the truth of that American dream about 3 weeks ago. And yes, one of them was gun safety and cutting crimes of violence in half. But another one was pushing for comprehensive and accomplishing comprehensive immigration reform. I have a tremendous amount of respect for the leadership of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and this invaluable institute. And I want to acknowledge some of the extraordinary young people in CHCI whose stories are exactly what it means to be an American. And it's what this battle for immigration and citizenship are really all about. Elias Flamenco, from my home state of Maryland, where is he? Yes. Elias is a CHCI Public Fellow. He was born and raised in El Salvador. Elias moved to Silver Spring as a teenager to reunite with his parents. In short order, he learned English, became the first in his family to attend college, and then put his degree to work in the cause of justice. And that's truly the American dream. Elsie Perez Herrera is from Las Vegas. Born in Mexico, Elsie grew up in the Las Vegas area, hearing disparaging comments about immigrants from the other kids at school, fearful that her own classmates might learn her story. Today, Elsie is a campus leader, a CHCI intern, and a proud fighter for citizenship rights for herself and millions of Americans like her. Elsie relies on DACA, and she's exactly why we need DACA and exactly why we need to do so much more. So Elsie, thank you for your leadership. They are the voices in our politics today. I know that there are voices in our politics today who are saying some pretty hateful things about new American immigrants, saying things that run contrary to the common humanity we share as a people. But Elias and Elsie represent more powerful voices and more numerous. And I have news for people like Donald Trump and those in the Republican Party who say these hateful things. And it is this: in our country, there is no such thing as an illegal person. Babies do not come shaped like anchors. And almost all of us had to make our way here at some point. Over land, over sea, we came here, or our parents did, or our parents before, or great-grandparents. In other words, we are a good, compassionate, and generous people, and we are a nation of immigrants, a pluribus unum, from many, one. And we wouldn't be such a strong nation and a beacon of hope to the world unless we were that diverse nation of immigrants. Our diversity is our strength, and our better days are ahead of us because of our adversity and our diversity and the arrival of new Americans in every single generation. There's nothing more American in my mind than to come here to live the American dream. That's what my great-grandfather did. His name was also Martin O'Malley. So the thing that many of you might know about the Irish is it's a shame. It's a whole race of people, but only 7 first names. He came here back in the late 1800s without any money. His first language was not English, it was Irish. He was a stranger in a strange land. But the hopes and dreams that he had for his children were purely American. Starting from zero, like so many other new Americans today, he worked beside a lot of other new Americans who risked their lives in the mines of Southwest Arizona to feed their families, to give their children and grandchildren a better future. And new Americans today have very similar experiences, the same drive, the same spirit, the same love of family and country that builds our nation up, one person and one family at a time. It's a spirit that has always made us the land of opportunity. Think about it. There's not another nation on the planet that has earned that brand of the land of opportunity. For many years, I have very intentionally and repeatedly used the term as an executive, mayor of a big city, and governor. I have used the term new Americans. Because the genius of our country is not so much about where you came from, it's where you're going and where we are all going together. There was a time when my great-grandfather arrived here, and when he was greeted with signs that said, help wanted, no Irish need apply. I always kept a sign like that on my desk as mayor and as governor, as a reminder that we were all once strangers in a strange land. But I suppose the truth of that, and the larger truth, is that we find ways to help each other. And that's why I have always seen in the eyes of our new American immigrant neighbors the eyes of great-grandparents that I have never met. You see, the cause we share is the same. The beliefs we share are the same. A belief in the dignity of every person, a belief in our own responsibility to advance and strengthen our common good. That's the dream made real by the Elias Flamenco's family, the dream made real by Elsie Perez Herrera's family, the dream made real by my own family, and by every family who loves their children and is willing to work hard in our country to give them a better future. It is, in short, the American dream made real that lifts all of us. As governor of Maryland, I fought to make that dream real every day, and we didn't wait for the polls to tell us that it was okay to do so. We did this by including more of our people more fully in the economic, social, and political life of our state, of our city, of our country. That's our formula for greatness as a country. In Maryland, we didn't wait for the federal government to act. We pursued our own DREAM Act to ensure that 36,000 dreamers could have access to affordable higher education. And after I signed it into law, as some of you may know recall who were Marylanders, our Republican brothers and sisters petitioned it to referendum in an effort to defeat it at the polls. But we made our case of human dignity and the common good we share to the people of Maryland, and we turned around those polls, and we succeeded in passing the DREAM Act at the ballot, the first state ever to do so, and we did it with 59% of the vote of the people of Maryland. And this was not merely a victory for the Dreamers' future, it was a victory for Maryland's future. The more all of our people learn, the more they will earn, the better our economy does. In Maryland, we expanded driver's licenses to new American immigrants because people need to get to and from work safely and obey the rules of the road. And the very start of my administration, in 2008, I established the New American Commission to highlight and welcome the skills that were being brought to our state by new American immigrants from numerous countries. And that effort was helped by our first labor commissioner, Tom Perez, a name that might be familiar to you now. I regret I have but one cabinet to give to my country. During my 2 terms as governor, we increased government contracts to Latino-owned businesses by 154%. We became the first state in the nation to pass a living wage. We expanded the Earned Income Tax Credit not once, but twice. We raised the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour so that by 2016, hundreds of thousands of Marylanders have finally gotten a raise. We froze college tuition for 4 years in a row, and we did a better job than every state but one at keeping down the cost of college tuition, which of course helped Hispanic students as well. They earned twice as many associate's degrees and bachelor's degrees during my service as governor as they had in the 8 years before. We also worked to keep Maryland's unemployment rate among Hispanic workers down to one of the lowest in the nation. Anyone can talk about these things and can make promises, but las palabras no son hechos. Del dicho al hecho hay mucho trecho. I've actually done it. I have actually done it. That's what you learn to do as an executive. We created real opportunity in Maryland. We invested in our people. We did it by including more of our people more fully in the economic, social, and political life of our country. We didn't make it harder for people to vote. We made it easier. Together, we made the dream real for more and more families. And here's what I believe we must do in order to break the impasse and actually pass comprehensive immigration reform. First, we are and always have been a nation of immigrants, a pluribus unum. Out of many, we are one, and it is in everyone's best interest. It is in the best interest of the economy of the United States and the security of the United States for us to reform a system that is callous, irrational, inhuman, unjust, and holds down wages for all Americans. We must pass comprehensive immigration reform. And I intend to begin as president by providing immediate and further relief to the millions of new Americans whose hopes have been dashed time and again because Congress has failed to do its job. In all but the most extraordinary circumstances, immigrant detention must end, and it must end forever. Those inhumane centers, detention centers, must be shuttered. Government contracts with for-profit prisons are bad policy and must be ended. I will overhaul the U.S. immigration system by creating an independent agency to set policy instead of continuing this perpetual fight. This is about our values as Americans. It's also about creating an economy that works for all of us, bringing our neighbors out of the shadow economy and into the light of an open and inclusive American economy. It's about making wages go up for all Americans. Our country's come a long way. We're creating jobs again. 67 months in a row, but we need to get wages going up and not down, and one of the ways that we do that and rebuild the American dream is by passing comprehensive immigration reform, and I intend to campaign on it. Now, I know that many leaders within the Republican Party vilify, scapegoat, and seek every opportunity they can to speak ill of new Americans. And they have fought tooth and nail against immigration reform. I know that many of us have been offended at the hateful things that Donald Trump has said about new American immigrants. And I don't find it funny. I don't find it entertaining. I find it harmful to the spirit of America. As you well know, Trump calls all new Americans from Mexico, quote, rapists and drug dealers and murderers. And his hate is exceeded only by his paranoia. Give him a few more weeks and he'll say we need to bring back the dunking tanks and start looking for witches. Now, you can dismiss Donald Trump as the racist carnival barker he is, but the problem is that he has infected the entire Republican field of candidates, and they want to be like him. Trump uses the epithet anchor baby, and then Jeb Bush uses it as well. Say what you will about George W., he never proposed administering citizenship tests to newborn infants. Trump says he'll build a really terrific wall on the border with Mexico. Then another Republican candidate says we should build one on Canada as well, apparently to keep out the metric system. Now, it is long past time that we remember who we are and what we stand for as a people. We are a compassionate and generous people. And the enduring symbol of our nation is not the barbed wire fence, it is the Statue of Liberty. And as a leader of nations, we must improve our relationships with like-minded people here in our own American hemisphere. Maybe it's an Irish sensitivity, but I have a soft spot for island people who are getting a raw deal and being treated poorly. I want to speak to you, therefore, about your fellow Americans in Puerto Rico. And our neighbors in this hemisphere on the island of Hispaniola. Boricuas have been our fellow citizens for almost 100 years. They have contributed greatly to our economy, fought and died to defend our country, but today they are suffering through what may be the worst economic and fiscal crisis on that island's history. We must not let their economy collapse. I led the field of candidates in our party in calling for Congress to approve legislation giving Puerto Rico the same ability to negotiate with its creditors that states have under the U.S. Bankruptcy Code. And I led the field in calling on the Department of Health and Human Services to end the inequitable treatment of Puerto Rico, where they pay the same in taxes but get back pennies on the dollar when it comes to Medicare, Medicaid, and the Affordable Care Act. And we all need to stand up with Puerto Rico and demand action. And on the island of Hispaniola, where mass deportations of Haitians and Dominicans of Haitian descent have already begun, I was the first and so far the only presidential candidate to call on the United States to work with our allies in the United Nations to use our full force of our diplomatic might to stop this atrocious affront to human rights here in our own hemisphere. We wouldn't tolerate the expulsion of citizens without due process based on skin color, ethnic background, and we shouldn't remain silent when such injustice is being perpetrated in our own hemisphere. Speaking up is the right thing to do, and we must all demand action. The people of our world care a lot more about what we do than about what we say. And that is why I pledge to you that I will always act in accordance with my principles and guided by the better angels of our country. That's who I am, and that's how I led, and that's how I will continue to lead. I want to leave you with this last American story. Many of you will remember the scene last year when refugee children were fleeing death gangs and traveling at great risk to their lives over the desert north from Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador, fleeing these murderous gangs. When children arrive on our doorstep fleeing starvation and death gangs, we must not turn our backs. We must not turn them away, or worse, pen them up behind chain link and barbed wire fencing in conditions that looked a lot more like those you might see at your local humane society than you would see in a humane country. No, we must act like the compassionate and generous people we have always been. I said at the time that we should care for these children decently and with respect for the dignity of every child, caring for them in foster homes, not in detention camps. Now, some governors around the country spoke of these children sometimes as if they were like a swarm of invading jackrabbits. But we took a different tactic in Maryland. I spoke to the goodness of our people. I said that we would welcome and we would do our part to alleviate this suffering. One of my advisors warned me at the time. He said, he himself, the son of new American immigrants, he said, "I love what you said about those Central refugee kids. But being a pollster, I have to tell you, I'm not sure how this one's going to turn out." Well, I did. I spoke truthfully to the goodness in every American heart, and people rallied. Faith leaders from every faith in our state came together to accommodate through foster care more children per capita in Maryland from Central America than any other state in the United States. It was the right thing to do, and the people of my state supported it. And here's the other part of that story. A few months later, when we held our traditional annual public open house at Government House, my wife and I stood in front of the Christmas tree, greeting a whole stream of citizens that came through in a long line to shake hands and say hello. One gentleman came up to me then, and there was a 13-year-old boy with him. And he said, "Mr. Governor, I want to introduce you to Emmanuel. He is 13, and he is one of those refugee children who just came here from Guatemala that you helped." And the little boy who had braved the desert and deprivation and death and worse, he came up to me and he shook my hand and then very quickly grabbed me around the waist in an embrace that I will never, ever forget. Emmanuel, God is with us. That little boy's dream is our dream. It is the dream of everything that's ever been possible in this beautiful and generous and compassionate country. Do you know who believes very firmly in the American dream and does not submit to the pessimism and the cynicism that many other Americans do? It is new American immigrants. Everyone who has ever risked their life to get here and make a better way believes in the American dream, will do anything to defend it and make it real, and defend and protect our country. I believe it. You believe it. Our better days are ahead of us. So now together, let us fight to make it true. Thank you very, very much. Thanks. Thanks. Thank you, guys. Thanks a lot.
Ladies and gentlemen, to introduce our next candidate, please welcome, representing New Mexico's 1st Congressional District, Congresswoman Michelle Lujan Grisham.
Woo! New Mexico, Nuevo Mexico in the house. I did it wrong yesterday. Clearly we're strong. I'm really delighted and honored to welcome you to the next part of this presidential candidate forum. I got the distinct pleasure of having an audience with the very impressive senator at the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and I know that, like me, you're going to find Senator Sanders inspiring and ready to go on so many of the issues that we care about. And with that, let me read you a little bit about the incredible senator. Now, he's serving his 2nd term in the U.S. Senate after winning re-election in 2012 with 71% of the vote. His previous 16 years in the House of Representatives make him the longest-serving independent member of Congress in American history. Senator Sanders has been one of the nation's most persistent voices, defending the interests of the working class and standing up to the excesses of corporate America for more than 30 years. He has consistently focused attention on the critically important issue of the growing gap between the rich and everyone else. Throughout his political career as a 4-term mayor of Burlington, Vermont, and as Vermont's congressman for 16 years and U.S. senator for 8 years, Bernie has always been an effective and articulate fighter for social justice. He has worked tirelessly in his 24-year tenure in Congress on issues that affect the needs of the people that government often ignores: working families, the middle class, the elderly, the children, the poor, and I'm going to add, and too many minority families. Senator Sanders, or Bernie, as he is known to the people of Vermont, played a key role in making sure that the Affordable Care Act substantially improved primary health in this country through a major expansion of federally qualified health centers and, quite frankly, an expansion in what we know as community health care. Without that expansion, my state, as an example, would have inadequate access for minority populations, in particular in rural and frontier communities. So I'm very grateful for that vision during the debate in the Affordable Care Act. Now, before I bring him out, I also want you to know that you are invited to join him right here up front at the stage for a meet and greet after his remarks. Now, please welcome the 2016 presidential candidate, Senator Bernie Sanders.
Thank you. Well, let me thank Congresswoman Grisham for that warm introduction, and I also want to thank Congresswoman Linda Sanchez and Esther Aguilera and all of CHCI staff for hosting me here today, and thank all of you very much for being here. The reason I am running for president is that this country faces some enormously serious problems. One could argue that if you include the crisis regarding climate change, there are more serious problems today than at any time since the Great Depression. And I know that much of the media thinks of politics as how much money you raise or what your standing is in the polls or what kind of dumb thing you said last night. But all of you understand that politics is in fact about the future of our country, what happens to tens and tens and tens of millions of people, many of whom are hurting today. And what I hope all of you understand, and I know you do, or you would not be here tonight, you would not be participating in the political process, is that if we do not bring people together, if we do not engage people in serious discussion, if we do not significantly increase the voter turnout, not good things will happen to our country. So what I ask of all of you is to engage in that debate, make sure that we have one of the highest voter turnouts in the world, not one of the lowest voter turnouts, and that we in fact start addressing some of the real problems facing our country. What I want to do today is touch on a few of those issues. And the first one I want to touch on is the need for real immigration reform. I also want to talk about the stain of racism which has existed in this country and in the world for God knows how many years. And I want to talk about the economic reality which faces our country, and that is we have a middle class which for the last 40 years has been disappearing, and we have massive levels of income and wealth inequality that we have got to address. Now, as everybody here knows, that throughout history, for whatever reason, and I'm not a psychiatrist, we have lived with a stain of racism on all of human existence. Now, in my own case, I know a little bit about racism and what it means. My father lost much of his family in Europe as a result of the Holocaust. And he came to this country at the age of 17, not speaking a word of English. So I think the first point that we have to make is a commitment to end institutional racism in this country. And let me just say this for a moment, is there can be disagreements among honest people about immigration reform. I'm going to tell you in a moment what my view is. But what is not acceptable is demagoguery. What is not acceptable is attempting to define one group of people, quote unquote, as rapists and criminals. That is not the kind of debate and discussion we need in America today. That is racism, that is unacceptable, and that has got to be rejected. One of the great strengths of America, people around the world don't realize it, is in fact we are a nation of many, many people, of many colors, of many backgrounds, of many languages. And in my view, that makes us a stronger nation, not a weaker nation. This is something we should be proud of. My dad came from Poland. Many of your parents came from other countries. But when we stand together as a people and we bring our different cultures together, we create a nation of extraordinary capabilities which becomes stronger because of our diversity, something we should be proud of. As I mentioned, my father came from Poland without a nickel in his pocket, couldn't speak English, and he never made a whole lot of money. I grew up in a 3.5-room rent-controlled apartment in Brooklyn, New York. My mother's dream was that someday she would be able to own her own house. She died young, never achieved that dream. But my dad was the proudest American that you could ever see because he understood the extraordinary opportunities that this great country gave him and his family. And the fact that a very poor young man from Poland could see his 2 kids go to college was something of enormous consequence for our family. Today, as all of you know, we have 11 million people in this country who are undocumented, 99% of whom came to this country to improve their lives, to escape oppression, to flee desperate poverty and violence. And let us be frank about an issue we don't talk about enough, and that is that today's undocumented workers play an extraordinarily important role in our economy. Without these workers, it is likely that much of our agricultural system would collapse. A simple reality. Today, undocumented workers are doing the extremely difficult work of harvesting our crops, building our homes, cooking our meals, and caring for our children. In fact, they are part of the fabric of America. And let me just take a brief moment to tell you a little story about my experience with, one of my experiences with undocumented workers. Back in 2007, I learned about the horrendous exploitation in Immokalee, Florida. Anybody here from Florida? All right, you guys heard of Immokalee? It's near Naples. It turns out that in Immokalee, Florida, that is a town where a lot of the tomatoes are grown, low-grade tomatoes that are used in McDonald's and in Burger King. And the people who harvest those crops are by and large undocumented. On the day that I arrived, the day that I came to Immokalee, Florida, just coincidentally enough, the U.S. attorney was announcing an indictment of some contractors there who employed people who worked in the fields on the grounds of slavery. This is the year 2007. People were being held in involuntary servitude by some contractors there on the tomato fields. And in Immokalee, I saw the conditions and the exploitation that undocumented workers lived under. They worked very long and irregular hours for very low wages. Their housing was abysmal. And the reality of their lives and why they were able to be exploited was they could not stand up for their rights because they had no legal status. And that's the simple fact of it. Now, this story has a somewhat happy ending in that we were able to hold a hearing on this issue, and that was when the late Ted Kennedy was chairman of the committee, and he and I worked together. We had a hearing. We brought some people up there. And the end of it all is, through a lot of reasons, a lot of great people there doing good work, we ended up improving wages and working conditions. But today, 11 million people who are in this country, they remain undocumented and are having and struggling to adequately feed their families. They came to this country to escape gang violence and desperate economic conditions. Let me also be clear on raising an issue that is not talked about very much, and that is when people come across the border, they know full well that there are employers who will hire them. And if anyone thinks that employers throughout this country do not know that the workers that they are hiring and in many cases exploiting are undocumented, then you don't know the history of America for the last 50 years. So where do we go from here? Well, I supported the 2013 comprehensive immigration reform legislation in the U.S. Senate. While it is a complicated piece of legislation, and it is a piece of legislation that can and must be improved, I believe that it provided a responsible path to citizenship so individuals could, in fact, come out of the shadows and people can walk the streets with safety. People can hold their heads high. People can have the protection of the law and participate fully and without fear in American society. And just to tell you a story, I was in Phoenix a couple of months ago, and after I spoke at a rally, a number of young Latino kids came up, and we chatted for a while. And there were tears coming down their eyes, coming down their cheeks, as they talked about their fear of being deported or of having their parents being deported. That is not the kind of existence, the kind of fear that we want millions of Americans, people living in this country, to experience. And that is why we must pass comprehensive immigration reform. Now, as many of you know, the Senate bill attempted to accomplish this important goal, and in my view, the time is long overdue for many of my Republican colleagues to end the demagoguery and, in fact, take up serious immigration reform. The Senate bill contained the provisions of the DREAM Act, which I strongly support. It is my belief that we should recognize the young men and women who comprise the Dreamers for what they are. They are American kids who deserve the right to be in the country they know as home. Now, that is not to say that I do not have significant criticisms of this long and very complicated piece of legislation. I believe the pathway to citizenship was unnecessarily linked to border security triggers, measures that many believe were put in place so that the path to citizenship would be delayed or even denied for the millions of undocumented individuals here, and I want to change those provisions. I also believe that the penalties and fines in the bill would be a bar, an impediment for low-income people, essentially preventing them from accessing the path to legal residency and eventual citizenship. To be meaningful, a pathway to citizenship needs to be achievable for the millions of workers at the lower end of the economic ladder. These and other barriers in the bill, including the time it takes, often more than a decade, that makes it a flawed piece of legislation which needs significant improvement. But in fairness, in a bipartisan way, at least the Senate did something. The time is very long overdue for the House to act. Now, until we can pass comprehensive immigration reform, and I hope that is sooner than later, we must be aggressive in pursuing policies that are humane and sensible and that keep families together. This includes taking measures that are currently available, including using the presidential power of executive order when it is appropriate. While the Senate passed the DREAM Act in its immigration bill, and while the House has not acted, I think President Obama did exactly the right thing through his executive order for deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA. DACA and deferred action for parents of Americans and lawful permanent residents were good first steps, but should be, in my view, expanded. Deferred action should include the parents of Dreamers. We should be pursuing policies that unite families, not tear them apart. Obviously, the Latino community is deeply concerned about the immigration issue, deeply concerned about issues of racism. But like every other group in America, the Latino community, maybe more than most, is deeply concerned about the state of the American economic and political system. And let me take a few moments to touch upon that. The economic reality of America today is that, yes, we are doing better than we did 7 years ago when President Bush left office and when we were losing 800,000 jobs a month, when the financial system was on the verge of collapse, and we were running up the largest deficit in American history. We are better off today than we were then. But, and here is the big but, what we should also recognize is that for the last 40 years, the great middle class of this country, once the envy of the entire world, has been disappearing. And that has accelerated since the Wall Street crash of 2008. And while millions of Americans today are working longer hours for lower wages, and while youth unemployment is outrageously high, and while young people cannot afford to go to college, and while we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country on earth, there is another economic reality that is taking place which needs a lot of discussion. And that is that the wealthiest people in this country and the largest corporations are doing phenomenally well, and almost all of the new income and wealth being created are going to the top 1%. Now, that's a fact. And I know that people get uneasy and uncomfortable about talking about it. But it is an issue that has to be put on the table, because we need to create an economy that works for all of us, works for seniors, works for the children, works for working families, and not just an economy that works for the top 1%. At a time when millions of Americans are working 2 or 3 jobs to bring in enough income and health care to take care of their families, it is not acceptable that Latinos make up more than 16% of our population, but have only 2.2% of the nation's wealth. It is not acceptable that youth unemployment in this country has reached tragic proportions. And I want to say a word on that, because this is an issue that is too rarely discussed. A couple of months ago, I asked some economists to do a study for me. And the study is, tell me what the real rate of youth unemployment and underemployment in America is. And this is what they reported back. If you are a high school graduate, not a dropout, a high school graduate between the ages of 17 and 20, if you are white, real unemployment is 33%. If you are Hispanic, real unemployment is 36%. If you are African American, real unemployment is 51%. Now, what this means is that we have millions of young people in this country, people who want to leave their homes, start a career, make some money, become independent, become adults, and yet they have no jobs and they have no education. And if anybody in this room thinks that it is a coincidence that when we have 5.5 million young people who are not in school and are not working, while at the same time we have more people in jail than any other country on earth, if you think that's a coincidence, you would be sorely mistaken. In my view, it makes a lot more sense to invest in education, invest in jobs, rather than in jails and incarceration. This is a huge issue. And by the way, I want to applaud the president for just yesterday announcing that thousands of people in jail for nonviolent crime will be released. And that is exactly the right thing to do. Together, we must end this dubious distinction of the United States having more people in jail than any other country, and we must move to the distinction of having the best educated population on earth. And as part of that whole issue of criminal justice reform, a huge issue, I have introduced legislation to eliminate privately run jails and immigration detention centers. And by the way, when you do that, you're ending the quota for detaining undocumented immigrants. Corporations should not be making profits on the incarceration of people in this country. But when we talk about our economy and where it is today, it is, first of all, the grotesque level of income and wealth inequality. Today in America, the top 1/10 of 1% owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. Got that? Top 1/10 of 1% owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. Today in America, with people working incredibly long hours, people working 50, 60 hours a week, 58% of all new income is going to the top 1%. In the last 2 years in America, the 14 wealthiest people in this country saw their wealth increase by $156 billion. That wealth increase in 2 years is more wealth than is owned by the bottom 130 million Americans. Wow is the right response. But it's more than wow. It is immoral, it is unsustainable, and we have got to change that. Essentially, what we have now is a rigged economy which says, heads they win, tails you lose. And we need an economy, and we can build an economy which works for the middle class, and that is exactly what together we have got to do. But when we talk about the economy, it is not just the grotesque level of income and wealth inequality that has to change. It is also the reality that if you have millions of people working 2 or 3 jobs, and let me tell you a story here. I was in Des Moines, Iowa a few months ago, and I talked to a guy who works for a church group at a farmer's market. And what he was doing is collecting the food that was not sold and taking it to an emergency food shelter. And I asked them, you know, what percentage of the folks who go to that emergency food shelf are working? And you know what his answer was? 90%. In other words, in Des Moines and all over this country, you got millions of people who are working really, really hard, but they are not earning enough money to adequately feed their kids. At the root cause of that problem is that we have a federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. Now, you could do the arithmetic as well as I can. Multiply 7.25 by 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, and what you will find is that wage is totally inadequate for anybody to survive with a shred of dignity. In my view, when you have a minimum wage, which is a starvation wage, we have got to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. That is $15 an hour over the next few years. And by the way, while everybody in this country, all low-income workers, would benefit, nearly 60% of Latino workers would get a raise under this proposal. When we talk about the future of our country, we also have got to recognize that we live in a highly competitive global economy. And if we are going to do well now and in the future, we need to have the best educated workforce that we can. And in that regard, it makes no sense to me that today we have hundreds of thousands of bright young people who have done well in school, who are qualified to go to college, but cannot go to college for one reason and one reason alone. And that is their families lack the money. That is absurd for two reasons. First of all, it is terribly unfair to those young people to say to them, you're probably never going to make it into the middle class. You're not going to become an engineer, a doctor, a scientist, a teacher, or whatever. You're not going to do that because your family lacks the money to get you a higher education. But it is also absurd for our country, which needs the best to develop the best intellectual capital that we can. And that is why I have introduced legislation and would fight to make happen as president that every public college and university in this country be tuition free. And the reason why that is a big deal is obviously it will help so many working class and middle class and lower income families, but it does something else. It tells children in the 4th grade or the 6th grade not to give up, to pay attention to their schoolwork, to do their homework. Because what it says is that any child in America, regardless of his or her income, will in fact be able to get a higher education, and that is a big deal. There is another issue which is of enormous consequence to this country and touches on every other issue. And that is the fact that as a result of the disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision, our campaign finance system has become corrupt, and I use that word advisedly, and American democracy is being undermined. It is not acceptable to me that we have a campaign finance system which today allows millionaires and billionaires to contribute as much money as they want into the political process in order to elect candidates whose job in life will be to represent the wealthy and the powerful. When you have one family, the Koch brothers, worth some $85 billion, when this one extreme right-wing family will be spending some $900 million in this campaign cycle, which is more money than either the Democratic or Republican Party will be spending. when you have one family outspending either of the major political parties in this country, my friends, you're not talking about democracy, you are talking about oligarchy, and that has got to change. And when we talk about election reform, I trust that all of you know, and I don't mean to be overtly partisan here, but I have to be, that in this country today, in Republican states, one state after another, there is a very concerted effort to suppress the vote, to make it harder and harder for people of color, for low-income people, for older people, for students to participate in the political process. And they do this under the guise of trying to protect their states from voter fraud. Voter fraud is a very serious issue. Fortunately, it hardly exists in America. And everybody knows what the intention is of those voter suppression efforts. What Republican governors and legislatures are saying is, we don't want a fair election. We want to do everything that we can to prevent people whose views are different than ours to participate in the political process. Now, I've run for office many, many times in the state of Vermont. Often I've won, sometimes I've lost. But it has never occurred to me to figure out a way to deny people who disagree with me the right to vote. So what we need is federal legislation that makes it clear and straightforward that any person in this country who is 18 years of age has the right to vote. Discussion ended. When we talk about where we need to go as a nation, we have a lot to be proud of in America, but that we have also some very serious problems. Let me give you a few examples. The United States of America today is the only major country on earth, the only one, that does not guarantee paid family and medical leave. Now, what that means is there are women today who are giving birth. If those moms and that family have sufficient income, mom and maybe dad will be able to stay home with the baby, get to love the baby, know the baby, nurture the baby in a way that babies deserve. But if that mother is low income or working class, the likelihood is that 1 week or 2 weeks after she gives birth, she will have to go back to work in order to earn income to take care of her family. Now, you hear a whole lot in this country about family values. Separating a mother from a newborn baby because she lacks the income to stay home is not a family value. It is the opposite of a family value. Now, in my view, we have made progress in this country against tremendous ideological opposition in increasing the number of people who have health insurance, and we did that through the Affordable Care Act. And we should be proud of what we have accomplished. Those of you who are young, who are under 26, can stay on your parents' insurance policy. If some of you or your parents have pre-existing conditions, we have ended the obscenity of insurance companies saying, oh, you have cancer, you had cancer 5 years ago, we're not going to insure you for cancer. We have ended that obscenity. And we have also provided insurance for some 15 million Americans who previously lacked health insurance. All of that is very significant. But what we have not done, and I hope all of you know that, is we have not ended the embarrassment of being the only major country on earth, the only one, that does not guarantee health care to all people as a right. And today we have 29 million people who have zero health insurance and many more who are underinsured with high premiums and high deductibles. So count me in as somebody who believes that health care is a right, not a privilege, and that we should move toward a Medicare for all single-payer program. All right, let me conclude my remarks by asking two favors of you, not for me, but for our country. Number one, when folks tell you, when your friends tell you, why are you wasting your time going to meetings where they're discussing all these boring issues like immigration or jobs or health care or climate change? Why are you wasting your time when you could be out partying? You tell them that when the second wealthiest family in this country is spending $900 million on this campaign, you tell them that politics is, in fact, very important. And who is elected president, who controls the U.S. House, who controls the Senate, who controls governor's chairs all over this country is of enormous consequence to their lives, to their parents' lives, and to their children's lives. So my first request of you is do everything that you can to engage people to get involved in the political process. We had an election last November. 63% of the American people did not vote. 80% of young people did not vote. So when ordinary people, by the tens of millions, do not vote, trust me, that void is filled by very wealthy and powerful special interests. Big campaign donors who absolutely do not want you to vote. They want you to think that politics is a joke, not worth your time. They think it's important so that we can give tax breaks to billionaires and millionaires, so that we can have trade policies which shut down plants in America and move abroad. They think politics is very important. But if you think that it's important that we create millions of decent paying jobs in this country, that we provide health care to all of our people, that we address the planetary crisis of climate change, that we end sexism and racism in this country, if you think those issues are important, then you better get involved very deeply in the political process, because we need you. And the second point I want to make to you is that you live today in the wealthiest country in the history of the world today. America is the wealthiest country in the history of the world. And that means that we all have got to think big, not small. Please do not get caught up in these debates that take place here on Capitol Hill about whether we cut education by 2% or whether we raise it by 1%. That's thinking small. What I want you to ask yourselves is, why is it that in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country on earth? Why is that? Why is it that in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, we're the only major country, doesn't guarantee health care to all people as a right or has paid family and medical leave? Why are we the only country? Why are we the country on earth, major country, that has more income and wealth disparity than any other major country? Why is it that in Germany and many other countries, their young people can go to college and graduate school and medical school tuition free, while in America, hundreds of thousands of families cannot afford to send their kids to college, while others by the millions graduate school deeply, deeply in debt? Why is that? And in my view, when we think about these issues, it comes down to the reality that we have a small number of people, people I call the billionaire class, whose greed has no end. They want it all. They want all of the economic benefits of our society. They want to control the political life of our society. And make no mistake, these people are enormously, enormously powerful. They fund politicians of both political parties. They control much of our media. In my view, the future of America, and whether or not we have an economy that works for all of us rather than just the top 1%, is to bring about what I call a political revolution. And what that means essentially is that all of us become engaged in the political process, that all of us demand that the next President of the United States and Congress start representing the vast majority of our people and not just the wealthiest people in this country. So with that, I would love to welcome many of you to the political revolution, and thank you all very much for hearing me out. Thank you.